Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome. I'm Peter Unwin from the Whitehall Industry Group and delighted to welcome you here this morning on behalf of WIG. A big thank you, as always, to our hosts, Freshfields this morning, and James Grand, a partner here, will say a few words of welcome himself in a minute. We've run, as you know, a lot of events on Brexit since June of last year. They have predominantly, of course, been looking at the UK position, and all the focus has been on that as that developed. And we've seen a little bit more of that now with the white paper, the debates in Parliament, and the various speeches that have been made. But of course, two things we have to remember are, first of all, this is a negotiation, and there are 27 member states and a commission and a parliament on the other side of the channel who will be on the other side of that negotiation. And of course, that those 27 member states and commission and parliament have other things on their plate as well, be it growth in Europe, refugees, migration, the reaction to the new US presidency, etc., as well as Brexit. So both those things are very important, and we're delighted and privileged to have this morning as our speaker Jacqueline Minor, who's the head of the representation of the Commission in London. Jacqueline is a lawyer by background, so should be at home in these surroundings. She's had a long career in the European institutions, over 30 years, partly in the European Court of Justice, but also in key posts in the Commission, in the internal market, and as Director of Consumer Policy in DG Sanko. And she's now been for, I think, 4 years this month, head of the representation in the UK. It is actually on the 4-year anniversary that Jacqueline will be retiring from the Commission, so she's stepping down next week. So we're particularly grateful that she's come to give possibly one of her last speeches in an official capacity here to us today. Before handing over to James for a few words, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. There's no fire test as far as I'm aware, so if the fire alarm goes, please follow the exit times and leave the building. Mobile phones off, please. And this morning, Jacqueline will be talking on the record during her talk. Indeed, we'll be filming it and it will be available on our website. But the Q&A session that follows will be under the normal Chatham House rules, and please, particularly important that we follow that this morning to enable Jacqueline and indeed you to talk frankly on a very sensitive subject. So that's very important. Jacqueline will speak for about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, and then I will compare questions from the audience. So please be ready with questions for her. And with that, over to James.
Right. Just a few words of welcome, particularly a very warm welcome to Freshfields Brookhouse Derringer. And the reason why I say that with such emphasis is I asked to go second so I could give a slightly more flamboyant introduction to today's speaker, who in the course of a long and distinguished career, her CV tells me, was from 1992 twice head of unit responsible for the professions. Now, why is this so significant? Well, the answer is that in breaking down the closed shop of national interests that was the European legal profession, I think the EU can quite justifiably say to itself that it has done an enormous service to UK legal services by destroying the barriers to the exercise of our profession throughout the EU. It created a huge opportunity for this firm and for many others beside, and it is an opportunity where we have been in the history of the EU. It's quite simply, the UK has been the EU's outright winners here. So, as you may notice, whenever you look at the board, success has many fathers. Perhaps too many, according to the legal press, but it is therefore with enormous pleasure that I'm able to introduce to you somebody who has a justifiable claim to be the mother of all. Thank you very much, Jacqueline Minor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James. I don't think I've ever been introduced as a mother before. But thank you. I have to say it was the opening up of professions, all professions, was a staged thing. And we did it first with the general directive and then with specific directives for lawyers. Lawyers were one of the hardest nuts to crack, I have to say, and particularly Luxembourg lawyers. As some of you may remember if you followed the saga of trying to get non-Luxembourgish practitioners into that jurisdiction. However, that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Thank you very much to WIG for inviting me. I've spoken to a group assembled by WIG on a number of occasions, and I've always found the discussion stimulating because there is as much expertise facing me in the audience as there is, as I am able to bring, I think, to this discussion. What I intend to do whilst on the record is to run briefly through the reaction in Brussels to the outcome of the referendum of the 23rd of June, to walk through the Article 50 process and to make a few comments about the likely track of negotiations. And then we go on to Chatham House rules, where I can respond as much as I'm able to your questions. So going back now nearly 8 months, to the day of the referendum and the day after the referendum, more pertinently. What was the reaction of the 27, of the Commission, of Brussels, the Brussels bubble, to the decision of the British people to leave the European Union? Well, I think there are three basic principles governing that reaction. The first was a great deal of regret. There was real sadness and shock in Brussels, probably more shock in Brussels than there was here, because I think it's true that the Brussels establishment found it almost unthinkable that any member state would wish to vote to leave. So there was a sense of shock, but there was also a really deep sense of regret and sorrow, because although the Commission had quite deliberately chosen not to take part in the referendum campaign, we felt we lacked any legitimacy in that campaign, it was clear that it had a view. And the view was that membership of the European Union had benefited the United Kingdom. We won't rehearse those arguments, but also that UK membership had been of great value to the European Union. And I think it's worth pausing as the process to leave the Union takes off, to remember the contribution that the UK has made to the European Union. It's not often talked about in that sense. You know, the single market is essentially a construction of a British commissioner, Lord Cockfield, and of many diligent British officials who fought hard to open up the market, not only in goods, but in services and capital. The Financial Services Action Plan opened up banking, insurance, investment management across the whole of the European Union. And that, again, was largely driven by British officials within the Commission, but also by a lot of persuasion and energy coming out of London. The enlargement of the European Union to include the states of Central, Southeastern and Eastern Europe was also a big British project, somewhat ironically, given the issue of migration from those countries. So it is, even as the UK leaves, it will leave behind a legacy. There will be the mark of British policy on the European Union for some time to come. So a great deal of regret, but also acceptance, resignation. And whereas I think in June there may have been a number of people in Brussels, elsewhere on the continent, who felt that the decision was reversible, that somehow a fudge would be found, that withdrawal would not actually take place, I think it has become clear in the time since then that Brexit is going to happen. And I don't think there are any illusions in Brussels that this can somehow be avoided, delayed, mitigated in any way. So regret, but resignation. That is the first principle. The second is that on the 24th of June, the President of the Council of Ministers, the President of the European Council, President of the Parliament and Jean-Claude Juncker all called for the UK to get on with it as quickly as possible. to make that notification of withdrawal almost immediately. I think, again, in the time since then, it has become apparent that that insistence on immediate notification was perhaps more of an emotional reaction than a reasoned one. And I think both sides have understood that it makes a lot of sense to have this pause that we've now had of nearly 8 months, going up to the end of March, maybe 9 months by the time notification is finally given, so that there is time to prepare, there is time to take an inventory of the issues that will need to be addressed, that everybody can get their ducks in a row, and that the negotiations can begin with an informed preparation having been completed on both sides. Certainly the European Union, the Commission, has spent the time as wisely as it can, preparing, putting together a team of people, quite a small team of people in the task force, 20 people or so, but drawing on the expertise across the Commission to consider all of the questions and issues that will need to be addressed in the withdrawal negotiations. But what the Commission has also said, and there has been, to my view, quite unprecedented and rather astonishing discipline from the 27 member states on this point, is that until there is a notification, there can be no negotiations. It's quite unusual, I think, for the European Union's member states to maintain such a solid front that has been maintained on this point. Of course, there have been the usual diplomatic contacts, there have been discussions at official level, but there have been no significant opening of the negotiations. There have been a mapping, and The Guardian did it, I think, on Monday. There has been a mapping, no doubt, in Whitehall. There's been a mapping in Brussels of what each member state considers to be its primary interest, its primary objective in the forthcoming negotiations. But no negotiations have happened. There have been no committee meetings with the UK and the 27. So until that notification letter arrives in the Council building, there will be no formal negotiation. And the third principle is that from the perspective of the remaining member states, the best relationship that any country can have with the European Union, any European country can have with the European Union, is to be a member of it. And that therefore it is not a statement of punitive intent to say that whatever relationship emerges between the United Kingdom and the European Union in the future, it will be suboptimal compared to membership. It's a statement of observed fact in the view of the other member states, a statement of belief. It's not intended to be vindictive or to sanction the United Kingdom, simply to say that membership of the European Union is a complex balance of rights and obligations. There are trade-offs between those member states, predominantly in the northwest of the European continent, who are open trading, have an open trading philosophy, with those perhaps elsewhere who will be a less open economy. It's a trade-off between those who have invested heavily in a social welfare model and those who have a more market-oriented approach to their economy. There are lots of trade-offs, and they are accepted, I think, by the remaining member states. The United Kingdom's membership has always been slightly tailored to its particular needs. There is no other member state which has as many opt-outs. It has a permanent opt-out from the euro. It has the power to opt in to justice and home affairs issues. It has the budget rebate, and of course it's not a member of Schengen. So it was already a fairly tailored package. It would have become more tailored after the February settlement that Mr. Cameron negotiated and which was quickly forgotten in the referendum campaign. And what all of the member states are now saying is, whatever future relationship emerges, it cannot be some form of even greater tailored membership. The four freedoms of the single market are, in the view of the other member states, indivisible. And thus, I think Mrs. May was only drawing the necessary conclusion when, in her Lancaster House speech, she said that the UK would no longer seek to be a member of the single market because it is prioritising immigration over that membership, controls on immigration, and therefore rejection of the freedom of movement of persons means that it cannot, the UK can no longer be a member of the single market. What the implications of that are, we might come to in questions and answers. Then very briefly, Article 50. I suspect that many of you will have Article 50 imprinted on your brains and certainly printed on your desks. It is on mine. I think it's a curious irony of the referendum that for a country which probably didn't know very much about the treaties of Rome as amended, the Treaty of Lisbon, there is one article of the treaty that everybody now believes they know about. So Article 50 says that any member state which takes a decision to withdraw from the European Union shall notify that intention in accordance with its constitutional requirements. Now, there has been a little hiccup in determining what the constitutional requirements were. We seem, I think, to have that clarified now. And notification, we assume, will take place before the end of March. My personal view is that whatever happens in the debates this week and next in the upper chamber, it is unlikely to delay notification beyond Mrs. May's self-imposed deadline. Once notification is made, and there is no specified form for that, what Jean-Claude Juncker has advised the Prime Minister is that she should keep her notification letter as short and as simple as possible. I'm not sure whether Whitehall agrees with that view, and perhaps, again, somebody might like to advance an opinion. I think that Mr. Juncker's advice is given for two reasons. One is that the greater detail you put into your withdrawal notice, the less wriggle room you subsequently have in negotiations. And I think Brussels is very aware that this is a process which looks both outwards to the other 27 member states, but also looks behind the Prime Minister to her party and the country. And she needs to manage opinion in the party and in the country at the same time as she is entering into negotiations with the other 27 member states. And that's a tricky balancing act. So simple in order not to tie either party down, but simple also because the next thing that happens after notification is that the 27 remaining countries will need to give the negotiator, which will be the Commission, in the person, or at least headed up by Michel Barnier, will need to give the Commission a negotiating mandate. And obviously there is a matching process there. So the more detailed the notification letter, the more detailed the mandate will have to be. And the more detailed the mandate is, the longer it will take to agree. And therefore, the time taken to agree that mandate will be deducted from the total available time for negotiations. As most people know, Article 50 sets, in principle, 2 years for the conclusion of the withdrawal agreement. That period can be extended by unanimity, unanimous agreement of the 27 and of the United Kingdom. The view in Brussels is that it's very unlikely for any extension, any significant extension, to be agreed, partly because, of course, the unanimity rule enables any member state to hold the whole process hostage for its particular interests. What I personally could see is maybe a month or two's extension if it was needed to complete the formalities, but not beyond that. So there's a 2-year period, but that's a maximum. And in reality, as Michel Barnier has said, those 2 years we will lose a couple of months at the beginning to agree the mandate, and we will lose several months at the end to enable the European Parliament to complete the process of giving consent. As a result, the actual real time for negotiations is probably closer to 16, 17 months. The aim would be to conclude the negotiation no later than the end of 2018, and probably somewhere around October, November 2018. Because the other significant date is the European Parliament elections, which take place in May 2019. The 27, I think, would expect the United Kingdom's withdrawal process to have been completed by then, so that it wouldn't be necessary to run those elections in this country. But it also has the effect that parliamentarians start to show much less interest in Strasbourg business and much more interest in getting re-elected in the early part of the year of elections. So to have a concentration of MEPs in Strasbourg to look at the issue of the withdrawal agreement, that really has to happen late 2018, early 2019. The withdrawal agreement has to be concluded by qualified majority vote of the remaining 27. And that is a majority based on the number of member states, 55% of the member states representing 65% of the population of the remaining 27. And there are places on the internet where you can look at exactly how many that works out at and the different permutations of who might or might not vote to agree the withdrawal. I think it's important to say that the Article 50 agreement focuses exclusively on withdrawal, on the disentangling of a relationship of over 40 years. And therefore, I think it's quite appropriate to talk about it in terms of divorce. And like most divorces, the first issue to be settled will be finances. What are the respective liabilities of the United Kingdom and the European Union? And like most discussions about finances, I suspect it will be very acrimonious. I imagine that obviously the focus eventually will get to the bottom line. But before they do that, they will want to discuss the method. What are the principles which should govern the calculation of the bill? And even that will not be an easy discussion. Article 50, therefore, the divorce, looking backwards, untangling the existing rights and obligations of the parties, it will not determine the future relationship. Article 50 itself says the agreement needs to be reached in accordance with the framework of the future relationship of the withdrawing member state to the European Union. So there is a reference in Article 50 to the future relationship. But that makes sense if, for example, you have a member state who's moving from Union membership to EEA membership. It makes the process of withdrawal much simpler. I do not think realistically that the kind of future relationship sketched out by the Prime Minister in her Lancaster House speech, elaborated on in the White Paper, I don't think anyone can realistically expect that agreement to be reached, concluded, signed, sealed, and delivered in 2 years. The most that either party could hope for is to have an agreement about the nature of the future relationship. And there are different ways in which that might be encapsulated. This was what was essentially done February last year in the Cameron settlement. But the actual process of negotiating the details of a relationship which will encompass not only trade, but cooperation on justice and home affairs, internal and external security, many other areas, will take a considerable period. Will probably be characterized as a mixed agreement, which means that it is subject to unanimous agreement of the member states, the then 27 member states of the European Union, unlike the withdrawal agreement, which is qualified majority, and also probably, depending upon the constitutional requirements of the countries, the remaining countries, to parliamentary ratification. And those of you who have followed the CETA agreement, the free trade agreement with Canada, will know that that is a process fraught with peril when it comes to Belgium's 7 parliaments. The CETA agreement was for a time held hostage by the Wallonia Parliament, a parliament which represents a population, I think, smaller than certainly smaller than Greater London, probably smaller than Sheffield. So that's a sign of the difficulties ahead. But as I say, the focus initially will be on settling the withdrawal. It is, of course, in the interest of the United Kingdom to try and ensure that there is a parallel discussion both about resolving the past relationship and agreeing on the future relationship. I think the other member states will wish to place more focus at the beginning, certainly, on resolving the past relationship, on the terms of withdrawal, before they move on to look at what the future might hold. And that's going to be one of the trickiest things for both parties, it seems to me, in this negotiation.
Okay, I'm afraid, I know some of you have got to get away at 9:30, so we'll call a halt to the formal proceedings then. Apologies if you didn't get a question in, but if you're able to stay for a bit of networking over coffee, then that's available outside. And on that, let me say a big thank you again to Freshfields, Brookhouse, Derringer, and to James for hosting us this morning. Just a quick word about some events coming up. We've got Martin Wolf on the 6th of March from the Financial Times, who's going to be talking about what he calls the crisis in democratic capitalism. Should be a fascinating talk. Our next Permanent Secretary briefing is Sue Owen from DCMS, who will be talking not just about the challenges facing her department, but also her role as diversity champion for the civil service. And on the 29th of March, we have our big Information and Cybersecurity Conference. Some big speakers there from the new National Centre for Cybersecurity. So if you're interested in cybersecurity, please have a look at that and consider coming along. But most of all, let me say a huge thank you to Jacqueline for talking to us this morning and answering our questions so frankly and clearly. We're particularly grateful that you came so close to your retirement from your post, and we wish you genuinely all the very best in your retirement from the Commission. I'm sure you're going to be in considerable demand as a commentator on events as they unfold over the next couple of years. So thank you very much indeed.